Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Father Zach Swantek, and I'm the chaplain at the Aquinas Institute, Princeton University's Catholic Campus Ministry. And today we kick off our spring series for our Faith and Culture lecture series. And we're very excited to have Christopher Beha here. And Marcus will introduce him in a moment, but just as the students have been hearing, they know how much I like him, at least through his works. I've read all of his books, and with great joy, and even mentioned him in the homily yesterday. But for myself and Father Joe, as both English majors, it's not too strange to enjoy books and find a fellow soul who is searching for meaning and truth and has a great love of books, but to also see how he's been able to give back and sharing in his writing. And we thought it was a perfect opportunity at the beginning of the Lenten season to have this talk on why I am not an atheist. So, and I'll have Marcus Gibson, our Director of Academic Programming.
Thank you, Father Zach. And thanks to all of you for coming out this evening to join us. I'm so thrilled to see a full house here this evening for our first speaker of the semester. My name is Marcus Gibson, and as Father Zach said, I serve as the Aquinas Institute's Director of Academic Programming, and I'm thrilled also to serve to help introduce our speaker this evening, Christopher Beha, who is a writer, a novelist, and a Princeton alum, class of 2002. And he's the author of four previous books, prior to this evening's work. One of his novels, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, was longlisted for the 2020 National Book Award, and now he's here to present to us a different kind of book, Why I Am Not an Atheist, The Confessions of a Skeptical Believer, where Christopher Beha tells us the story of his encounter with two different forms of atheism, scientific materialism and romantic idealism. His passage, the journey he goes through these different forms of atheism, leads him to conclude that faith preserves the best of both of these forms of atheism while offering a complete and coherent picture of reality. So here to tell us this evening why he is not an atheist, please join me in welcoming Christopher Beha.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I understand this is an exam week, so I'm particularly grateful that you guys are here. This is not how I would have been spending a Monday night as an undergraduate, which is part of the story, I suppose, that I'm going to be telling, but makes me all the more grateful that you guys are all here. So I want to thank Father Zach, I want to thank Marcus, I want to thank the Aquinas Institute for having me here. I would like to mention my sister, Mary Alice Tatey, who is both a Princeton resident and an alumna of the university. And without her, I would certainly not be here tonight. So I'm grateful for her making this happen. So I'm here to talk about this book, Why I'm Not an Atheist, The Confessions of a Skeptical Believer. The book recounts two parallel stories, one personal, the other world historical, and both connected in a way to this university. The personal story concerns my upbringing in the Catholic Church, my decision while a student here at Princeton a quarter century ago to leave the Church, my effort to find secular answers to many of the questions religious faith seeks to answer, and my eventual return to the Church, occasioned partially, but only partially, by my dissatisfaction with those secular answers. The larger world historical story involves roughly the efforts of the modern West to find answers to these same questions during the decline of first Catholicism and then Christianity more generally as the default Western worldview. The two stories are linked by the simple fact that my own effort to answer these questions entailed reading my way through the history of modern Western philosophy. As it happens, I didn't study much philosophy at Princeton, and almost all of the reading I'm talking about in this book took place after I left the university. But I still see it as a very Princetonian response to my situation, inasmuch as it involved the assumption that I was simply smarter than everybody, and that I could solve my problems through the effortful application of my intelligence. This book is in some ways the result of that effortful application, but it is also an argument that we can't think our way out of every challenge life throws us, which may be a particularly difficult thing for the crowd on this campus to hear. As many of you know, this talk was supposed to take place last Monday. At the time, I intended to test out what I expected to be my standard pitch for the book, with some adjustments, of course, to acknowledge the role this place played in the story. As it turns out, the delay has been something of a blessing because two things happened in the intervening week that led me to change my approach. The first was that I had two other events in non-academic settings in which multiple adults around my own age or older told me that I had raised for them issues that they hadn't really thought about since their time as undergraduates. And this naturally made me rethink how I was going to present this information to a room full of mostly undergraduates. The second thing that happened was that I went to Mass yesterday and heard a gospel reading that many of you may also have heard, the story of the Transfiguration. Taken together, these two things changed my thinking about what I wanted to say to you all, which, if you're thinking this through, means that much of what follows was written somewhat hastily in the last 24 hours, so you will have to excuse the rough edges on it. Before I go any further, I'm going to give everyone a refresher on this gospel reading, though I'm sure at least some of you did hear it. As it is told in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus brings three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up to a high mountain. There they find him utterly changed, his face shining like the sun, his clothes a magnificent white, and they see Moses and Elijah standing with him. Peter offers to build 3 tents or stalls for them, an idea the Gospel seems to treat as slightly fatuous. At any rate, Peter is interrupted by the appearance of a bright cloud, and a voice from the cloud tells the disciples to listen to Jesus. For our purposes, the last notable piece of this story is that on their way down from the mountain, Jesus tells his disciples to tell no one about this vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. How does this story relate to the story I tell in my book? How might it relate to the remark I heard a few times last week that my book deals in questions that some readers haven't grappled with since their own days in college? Well, there happens to be a persistent theme throughout intellectual history of going up the mountain, finding there some unmediated truth that surpasses the capabilities of human language, while also finding that our desire to build a tent notwithstanding, we can't really stay up there in that place. It's not livable. We have to descend again to ground level, common human society, and we are not likely to be able to talk there much about what we saw on the mountain. This trope dates back at least to Moses, who spent all that time up on Mount Sinai and found the human society to which he returned so disordered that he smashed the tablets that were his record of that experience. In Plato's Republic, Socrates flips the spatial arrangement somewhat. It's not that the truth is up on the mountaintop, but that we are stuck down in a subterranean cave. Either way, it takes a difficult ascent to find ourselves standing in the light of truth, and those back down below are destined to find our description of it frankly insane. Some 2,000 years later, one of Socrates' and Christianity's greatest antagonists, Friedrich Nietzsche, repeats this figure as his Zarathustra comes down from the mountains to tell the people in town that God is dead and to bring the news of the coming of the Superman, news they treat with ignorant misunderstanding. I am talking here not just about the well-known distinction between the active life and the contemplative life, but something rather deeper. I'm talking about the very possibility that there might be felt truths that surpass our powers of communication. This is a possibility that people long took for granted throughout human history. Many of the great medieval mystics had no desire to write down their experiences, but were encouraged, and in some cases compelled to do so by religious superiors, whether for the edification of others or in order to assure the orthodoxy of their beliefs. Presumably there were countless other mystics whose names we don't know today because they were not so compelled. Perhaps no man in history worked more fervently to put truth into words and make it consistent with reason than the namesake of our hosts tonight. But St. Thomas Aquinas also believed that the reality of God, which was, of course, the greatest of truths, far outstripped our language, that it could only be approached by way of the via negativa. Just a few months before his death, he also had a mystical experience that led him to give up on his writing entirely, because he thought this writing, beside the experience, was like so much straw. I trust that many, perhaps all of you, have had some deeply felt experience that you have found yourself incapable of adequately expressing, even to yourselves. It may seem an obvious feature of life that not every truth is expressible, perhaps even that the most important truths are not expressible. But it happens that the secular tradition that I discuss throughout my own book has had a very hard time with this idea. For this tradition tends towards what's called the correspondence theory of truth. That is, the truth does not inhere in the world, but the truth is a status that certain statements can have, depending on how accurately they describe or correspond to the world. Now, I'm going to just digress quickly because this idea can cause some problems for this tradition. I've called my book Why I Am Not an Atheist rather than say Why I Am a Theist, in part as my own effort at the via negativa. So I am saying exactly what it is that I do not believe rather than saying what it is that I do believe. But it is also an allusion to a work called Why I'm Not a Christian by a writer named Bertrand Russell. I'm interested to know how many people in this room are familiar with Bertrand Russell. Can we see a show of hands? A good number. So Russell was, throughout much of the 20th century, the world's most famous philosopher. He was the last English language philosopher to have a wide mass readership. And he, in fact, was given the Nobel Prize for Literature and is the only writer who is primarily a philosopher to have been awarded it. He was also a deep believer in this correspondence theory I discussed. He thought that only two sorts of statements could be tested for their truth or falsehood. One were statements of fact, descriptions of matters of fact in the world, that is to say, empirical statements. And then the other was logical statements, particularly the kind of logic represented by mathematics. And his belief about the way truth worked was that the empirical sciences gathered facts about the world, and then we could use logical statements to arrange those facts in ways that could give us additional knowledge. He further believed that philosophy's sole job was logical analysis. Philosophy's job was to clean up our language so we knew that it was properly going about this arrangement of facts into truth. His contribution to this effort was, first and foremost, co-authoring a multi-volume work called the Principia Mathematica, which reads to a layperson like it is written in mathematics. It is an attempt to put mathematics itself on a logical footing. And it is the work for which he gained his philosophical reputation, but it is truly, truly impenetrable for a non-specialist. So how is it that he was also the most widely read English language philosopher? Well, the answer is he wrote a great deal about ethics, about religion, about political life, and he was what we would now think of as more or less a pundit. And this was the work that both gained his audience and gained him the Nobel Prize. And yet, by his own standards, everything he wrote in those works was fundamentally meaningless because it could not pass this verification-falsification test, right? To say, for example, that Christianity is itself a moral evil is neither a logical claim nor a claim about matters of fact. It is a value judgment. And by Russell's own standards, value judgments were fundamentally meaningless. So what was it that Russell was doing while he was writing all of the works for which he became famous, including a work like Why I'm Not a Christian, that would go on many years later to be read by a young Princeton undergraduate who a further 25 years later is standing before you now. I'm going to set that question aside briefly and return to the main body of the argument here. I want to talk about the steps that got us, roughly, from the view of Aquinas and his fellow scholastics to the view of a person like Russell. And this starts with the works of the French essayist Michel de Montaigne. For my purposes, it is a nice coincidence that this name actually translates to Michael of the Mountain. He was born into a family of French nobility in 1533, spent his early adulthood as a member of the local parliament, and upon inheriting his family's estate, he resigned this position, retired from public life, and spent the next decade reading, thinking, and writing a series of short literary reflections that together stretched to nearly 1,000 pages. In other words, he left the marketplace, he left the town, and he went up to the mountain. Montaigne was fluent in Latin as well as French, and he had a comprehensive knowledge of Roman literature. His study of classical Stoicism and Epicureanism, his knowledge of the most recent discoveries about the human and the natural world, and his frustrating experience with politics during a period of extreme religious conflict all gave him an unusually detached perspective on his own time and place. The great cause of these religious conflicts in Montaigne's view was the idea that we could argue rationally about spiritual matters. One might think that the inability to argue rationally about spiritual matters was what drove people to violence, but Montaigne blames instead the notion that religious questions have a knowable answer to which all people could be expected to consent. In other words, he denigrated the metaphysical speculations of Aquinas and his scholastic brethren, which is perhaps more forgivable once we know that Aquinas himself came to do the same. In his longest and most famous essay, Apology for Raymond Sebon, Montaigne expresses his allegiance to Pyrrhonism, a school of extreme ancient skepticism that advocated suspending judgment on any point about which you could not be completely certain. Montaigne's doubt was so profound that he would not even say, as Socrates did, that he knew only that he knew nothing. He preferred to put the matter into a question. What do I know? These words I bear as a motto inscribed over a pair of scales. Que sais-je? Montaigne's tolerance and moderation have made him an intellectual model ever since he first published his essays in 1580. I read some of them here at Princeton, not in philosophy courses, but in the literature department, where he was justly revered as the creator of an enduring literary form, the essay. And I came to know him as an exemplary modern figure, a man who threw off the yoke of tradition in favor of a close examination of the self. Reading his work in its entirety a few years after I graduated, I found something slightly different. First of all, Montaigne's essays contain countless expressions of Christian piety. Present-day readers often take such professions of faith among early modern thinkers as self-protective fig leaves, and this is clearly correct in some cases. But Montaigne seems sincere in his belief, and he actually anticipates the charge. Excuse me for a second. All evidence suggests that he was a sincere believer. Does this mean he was a hypocrite? Was he not, after all, the skeptic he claimed to be? Quite the opposite. Skepticism about human knowledge motivated his belief. What struck him most about the doctrinal disputes between Catholics and Protestants was that they attempted to argue rationally about details without recognizing that the entire system rested on faith. Montaigne did not at all oppose taking things on faith. Given the limits of reason, he thought we had no choice but to do so. We don't need to stop taking things on faith. We need to stop imagining that the principles we've taken on faith were arrived at through reason, and that we can reason other people into sharing them. Those who followed Montaigne treated this skepticism less as an inspiration than as a challenge. Montaigne did not seek to replace the prevailing scholastic rationalism with a new secular rationalism. He replaced it instead with pure faith, because his skepticism told him that this was the only option available. For those who wanted to move beyond faith, skepticism would become not a rallying cry, but a problem to be solved. If we can't rely on religious tradition or scriptural revelation or ecclesiastic authority to deliver the truth, what can we possibly know? Not long after Montaigne's essays appeared, the statesman and philosopher Francis Bacon brought this word into English for his own collection of short meditations. The first of Bacon's essays, Of Truth, explicitly invokes skeptics in Montaigne's mode who, quote, count it a bondage to fix a belief. Bacon admired Montaigne, but he insisted that it was possible to establish a foundation on which real knowledge could be built. For Bacon, that foundation was practical use. Like Montaigne, Bacon had a political career that influenced his philosophical work, though his unfolded far closer to the centers of power, including stints as England's Attorney General, Solicitor General, and Lord Chancellor. Retiring voluntarily from public life and dedicating himself to study would have been inimical to Bacon. Instead, his career ended ignominiously and involuntarily by way of a bribery conviction. He was constantly considering how his philosophical thought could be put to practical use. When James I ascended to the throne in 1603, Bacon published a treatise in which he called on the new king to be a patron of intellectual life. The Advancement of Learning's first volume considers the factors that had impeded the accumulation of knowledge up to that point. In Bacon's view, the greatest impediment of all was, quote, the mistaking or misplacing of the last or furthest end of knowledge. That end, Bacon insists, is the benefit and use of men. A true flowering of knowledge could occur only when contemplation and action were more nearly and straightly conjoined. Bacon is today known for his development of inductive reasoning, moving from observed data points to general principles rather than arriving at general principles through abstract reasoning and then applying them to our experiences. A key feature of this method in Bacon's view is that it builds on itself, producing new technologies that can be used for the betterment of mankind and also allow for more sophisticated experiments and thus more sophisticated technologies, creating a kind of feedback loop, forever accelerating the rate of progress. In his speculative fiction, The New Atlantis, Bacon describes the discovery of an island culture that has attained a utopian level of material comfort through the creation of a kind of research institute he called Solomon's House. Bacon did not just believe as an ethical or political matter that learning ought to have the aim of human betterment. He believed as an epistemological matter that usefulness was our best test of knowledge. The way out of Montaigne's skeptical morass was, quote, to separate and reject vain speculations and whatsoever is empty and void, and to preserve and augment whatsoever is solid and fruitful. It's pretty easy to see where things go from here. If usefulness is the arbiter of truthfulness, then any mountaintop truth that can't be brought down to the marketplace is not a truth at all. It is a short distance from here to Bacon's empiricist successor David Hume, who might have been speaking for Bertrand Russell himself when he wrote, quote, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Here I'd like to stop and quickly make one other point. You will have noted Hume's use of the term school metaphysics. He means by that term school, of course, to refer to Aquinas and other scholastics. As university students who have elected to spend an otherwise free Monday night hearing me speak, you may be interested to know that the ancient Greek word schola, from which that word comes, means leisure. For the Greeks, this did not mean going to lawn parties. It indicated any activity that was done as an end in itself. Beyond a fairly rudimentary level, education had little practical value in the ancient world. It was economically advantageous to know how to read and write, and you needed knowledge of the law and its proper application to participate in Athenian public life, but most study, including study of the natural world, was done for its own sake, to satisfy our inherent desire to know. Because the medieval thinkers who later put Aristotle at the center of European culture lived lives of monastic leisure, they became known as scholastics. They pursued the liberal arts, so called because they were free of the demand to serve other ends than their own. Like Aristotle, the medieval schoolmen recognized both the vita contemplativa and the vita activa as necessary components of a full human life, but they utterly rejected the idea that the fruits of scholarship could be judged by their practical application. They sought to understand the workings of the natural world because this world was God's creation, and knowing it was a way to know God. This all began to change with Francis Bacon, and higher education was among the things that changed with it, as there now sprang up research universities on the model of Bacon's Solomon's House. Ever since then, there has been a widening divide between theoretical and practical studies, between the humanistic and the technological, between learning for its own sake and knowledge as a form of power to be put to use in the world. The modern knowledge economy makes higher education an economic necessity. As we spend more and more on this good, it becomes more and more imperative that we see a proper return on that investment. In the process, the liberal arts are increasingly squeezed out as economically irrelevant. Every major university, including those that predate Bacon's time, has become first and foremost a research center. The guardians of the liberal arts have tended to respond to this problem by making some case for their economic value. I want to make a different case, that the kind of learning humanistic study entails is a good in itself, a form of necessary leisure. If it must be understood as a training for something, it is not critical thinking or adaptability or some other soft skill, but training for yet higher leisure. In humanistic study, we learn the discernment that allows us to enjoy profound works of art, the paintings, movies, music, and literature that do not make their power immediately accessible to the untrained eye, ear, or mind. We also learn the discipline and self-mastery that make a lifelong relationship with these works possible. Losing our sense of education as leisure is the first step in losing our sense of leisure entirely. Here we come finally around to those listeners who told me that they hadn't considered many of the matters discussed in my book since their own undergraduate days. It might be said that they came down from the mountain once and for all upon graduation, and that they found the mountaintop truths to be useless to them down below. This seems to me not an argument for giving up on the mountain, but an argument for getting back up there as often as possible, given the exigencies of life down below. I want to encourage you all, while you're here, to cultivate those mountaintop experiences. Not because I think they will be useful for you later, but for precisely the opposite reason. And I do have a little more time, and so I'm going to say a bit more about one other thinker in this tradition who comes immediately after Russell. Perhaps nobody in human history has thought more about the possibility that there are truths that cannot be expressed than Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was the youngest of 8 children born to one of Europe's richest men, all of them seemingly brilliant and most of them quite troubled. 3 of his 4 brothers committed suicide. The 4th lost his right arm in World War I and became the greatest one-handed piano player who ever lived. The family was highly musical, highly cultured in general, among fin de siècle Vienna's greatest patrons of the arts. Brahms and Mahler attended the Wittgenstein salons. Music and literature would have a profound influence on Ludwig's life, but his early interest was engineering. Of all the children, he seemed the most likely to follow his father into industrial manufacturing, and he was sent to England to study aeronautics. These studies led Wittgenstein to an interest in pure mathematics, which in turn led him to Bertrand Russell. He showed up on Russell's doorstep with no training in philosophy. As I said, Russell was the most famous philosopher in the world, and told him he wanted to study with him, although he was an engineering student in Manchester, some ways away, and not a student at the University of Cambridge. Russell did not know at all what to make of him. He referred to him as my ferocious German. But he came eventually to think that Wittgenstein had profound truths to give to philosophy. He also came to worry that Wittgenstein would never set these truths down, because he had no interest in publication or professional advancement. He simply wanted to know the truth. Russell thought it likely that Wittgenstein would go mad or take his own life before completing a publishable work. This fear became more acute when Wittgenstein announced his intention to move to Norway, live in isolation for several years, and put his interior life in some order. "Perhaps you regard this thinking about myself as a waste of time," he wrote to Russell, "but how can I be a logician before I am a human being?" At the start of World War I, Wittgenstein enlisted on the Austrian side. He was eager to put himself in harm's way, and he expressed deep frustration at spending the war's first years safely stationed in Krakow. During this time, he finally began writing his thoughts on logic into a manuscript. His writing took a dramatic turn when he was sent to the Eastern Front. He spent 2 years fighting in the Romanian trenches, during which Russell and others in Cambridge had no contact with him, no idea whether he was alive or dead. By the time they heard from him again, Wittgenstein was in an Italian POW camp, and he had completed the only book he would live to see published. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is arguably the greatest philosophical work of the 20th century, and certainly one of the most challenging, but it is also a rare work whose point can be summed up in a few lines. Wittgenstein himself gave this summary in the book's preface, and again in its final pages. "What can be said clearly, and whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent." That a book that aims to prove the clear simplicity of expressible truth should prove so difficult to comprehend was an irony Wittgenstein recognized and regretted. The fact that his work was not easily understood frustrated and puzzled him. Having spent years arriving at his insights and putting them into literary form, he believed the results ought to be self-evidently true. In fact, a major part of his argument was that all real truth is self-evident. The book sets out to address two problems raised by the logical analytic tradition that says that all meaningful statements concern either matters of empirical fact or matters of logical relationship. The first sort of statement raises the first problem. How do statements and facts relate to each other such that one can take the former to describe or contain the latter? In other words, what is it about a factual statement that allows us to check it against an experience or a state of affairs, and thus to classify it as empirically true or false? The second class of statements produces a second kind of problem. The idea behind formal logic is that empirical data that have been properly checked against reality can then be plugged into logical equations, and that the results will have validity, provided that the equations were themselves properly formulated. But what does it mean for such logical statements to be properly formulated? The truth of a logical statement is a different kind from the truth of an empirical statement, for there really is nothing to check it against. The general understanding is that the truths of mathematics and other systems of logic emerge from the fact that these systems are self-contained and internally consistent. So long as one follows a system's rules, the results will be legitimate. If the system produces results that are contradictory or absurd, either the rules are not being applied properly, or the rules themselves need to be clarified or adjusted in some way. But logical systems are notoriously bad at talking about themselves, so they must take for granted certain rules that they cannot prove. What makes the rules true? And how can we be sure that we are applying them properly? How could we ever recognize the results of an otherwise legitimate application of the rules as contradictory or absurd, and thus calling the rules themselves into question, if the system itself is the guarantor of logical coherence? These are the subjects of metalogic, and they require stepping outside of a given system to posit certain basic axioms and definitions. To get the whole of logic from just a handful of posited truths seems like a fair deal. But Wittgenstein thought that the moment we step outside the system in this way, we've entered an infinite regress. If the rules of a system aren't logically formulated and consistent with each other, the whole system is useless. But how can we know that our metalogical assertions take a logical form? Do we need a meta-metalogic? And a meta-meta-metalogic, and so on? Ultimately, we are forced to take certain things on faith, which is just what we were trying to avoid. You may have noticed that these two problems have a similar form. In both cases, we want to be able to define certain basic terms, but to do so requires making use of other terms, and at some point we simply have to let things mean what they mean. Wittgenstein's breakthrough was to understand these problems as the same problem, and to solve them at one go, by way of his famous picture theory of language. I'm going to just take a few more minutes on this, and I promise we'll bring it home. How does a picture of a house represent a house? Well, it just does. It represents a house by looking like a house. A picture is a model of reality, as Wittgenstein puts it. It stands outside its object and represents it. But a picture cannot place itself outside its form of representation in order to represent that form. For that, we need another picture with another form. If you don't know what a house is, perhaps you are from some nomadic culture that lives only in tents, the picture can't tell you what it shows. But if one tries to solve this problem by adding a title that reads, "This is a picture of a house," you aren't in any better shape, since the word has no meaning for you. You already, as it were, know that it's a picture of a house. What you don't know is what a house is. Meanwhile, those of us who do know what a house is don't need, in addition to the picture, the information that the picture is a picture of a house. Either the information is right there in the picture itself, or else the picture is not, in fact, a picture of a house. I'm going to skip forward a little bit and simply say that Wittgenstein believed that statements worked this way. They had to either self-evidently capture the truth they meant to capture, or self-evidently fail to do so. There could not be some additional metalogical system by which we showed the one to correspond with the other. But here another irony arises, because the Tractatus consists entirely of assertions of just this kind, metalogical assertions. And Wittgenstein knew this. He begins his preface by suggesting as much, speculating that the book will perhaps only be understood by those who have themselves already thought the thoughts which are expressed in it. Near the end of the book, he describes the work as a ladder that can be tossed away once someone has climbed up it. My propositions are elucidatory in this way, he concludes. He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless. The part of the Tractatus that deals with the picture theory, which is to say most of it, seems to have been completed before Wittgenstein was sent to the front lines, and he considered it preliminary to the rest of the work, which is dedicated to applying these points to various perennial philosophical questions, particularly questions of ethics and the meaning of life. In one sense, Wittgenstein's views on these subjects is wholly consistent with the larger analytic tradition, for it clearly follows from Wittgenstein's other theories that we can't say anything meaningful about the significance of the world as such from within the world. That includes any value statements, but also more generally any statements about what things mean. In the world, everything is as it is and happens as it does happen, Wittgenstein tells us. In it, there is no value, and if there were, it would be of no value. Very near the end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein suggests that what he takes to be the right method of philosophy, to say nothing except what can be said, i.e. the propositions of natural science, i.e. something that has nothing to do with philosophy. And then, always, when someone else wished to say something metaphysical, to demonstrate to him that he had given no meaning to certain signs in his propositions. But Wittgenstein understands the consequences of this approach very differently from someone like Russell. He truly believed that his work had solved all the problems of philosophy, but he also believed that in doing so it had shown how little had been done once those problems were solved. What is there still left to do? Wittgenstein speaks at several points in the book's last pages of the riddle of life. What is this riddle? He doesn't say. Indeed, he insists that he could not say. To be able to frame the question would mean being able to say what form the answer would take. From the standpoint of his own philosophy, quote, the riddle does not exist. Yet he makes it fairly clear that the riddle does, in fact, exist. It's tempting to speculate that the riddle is some version of the question, what value does life have? In other words, why go on living? Why not just give it up? As Wittgenstein often considered doing, and as three of his brothers ultimately did. The kinds of scientific statements that his own philosophy allows as meaningful will not answer that question. We feel that even if all possible scientific questions can be answered, the problems of life have still not been touched at all. To the Tractatus' earliest readers, the concluding references to a mystical whereof we cannot speak seemed a form of intellectual fastidiousness. A good empiricist would not insist that there is simply nothing beyond the bounds of language and sense experience. It is enough to say that whatever lies out there is beyond our reach. But when Russell was finally able to meet with Wittgenstein after the war, he was shocked to find him turned into a full-blown mystic. Russell expected Wittgenstein to return to Cambridge and take up a professorship. After all, he was the greatest philosophical mind of his generation, and he now had a finished work that could earn him a proper degree and a position. But Wittgenstein took seriously the idea that he had solved philosophy's outstanding problems. In the process, he had convinced himself that the problems of philosophy were not actually the problems of life. For Wittgenstein, the last pages of the Tractatus had become the point of the whole project. He had questions that needed to be answered, and he thought that philosophy might answer them. Now he knew that it would not. Soon after the armistice, Wittgenstein renounced his inheritance, leaving his share of the family's enormous fortune to his surviving siblings. He took jobs as a school teacher in several small Austrian villages, and yes, they were in the mountains. By all accounts, he was a terrible teacher. Severe, ill-tempered, frustrated by the slowness of his students. This is hardly surprising, as he had already shown himself frustrated by the slowness of some of the smartest people alive. This teaching career ended in 1926 when he struck one student until he collapsed, and the student's father tried to have him arrested. Wittgenstein resigned his position and presented himself at a nearby Benedictine monastery, where he inquired about joining the order. The abbot turned him down. Wittgenstein nonetheless stayed for several months, working instead as a gardener. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Christopher Beha. We have time now for some questions. We have a microphone in the room. Do we still have the mic?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Dee, if you could help with that, just for our first question, please raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to you, and speak your question into the microphone. We'll pass the microphone around the room to those of you with questions. Thank you.
Is this working? Is this on? Thank you very much, Mr. Beha's terrific talk. Much enjoyed. I want to ask you, so you said why you're not an atheist, but why have you chosen to return to Catholicism as opposed to another religious tradition, or to invent one of your own, a mysticism of your own, what have you? I just want to know why you've chosen the Christian faith, and particularly the Catholic version of the Christian faith.
Sure. Well, I'll say a few things about Christianity first. So I spoke about the mountaintop and the world below, and I spoke a little bit about the necessity of living in both. There's a sense among a lot of people that Christianity denigrates this world in favor of a view of the world to come. And in fact, there's a sense that some people have that in doing so, Christianity overturned a pagan tradition. This is Nietzsche's view that celebrated life as it is, and that it introduced sort of this idea that really we needed to focus on the metaphysical rather than the physical. But I'm sure that all of you know that that is not in fact true. That element of Christianity comes from Neoplatonism. It comes from Greek philosophy that long predates Christianity. Christianity, as the saying used to go, combines Athens with Jerusalem. So the Jerusalem part of it is that Christianity is a heretical Jewish sect that shares with the tradition from which it sprang the belief that we live in a material reality that was created by God, and as such is fundamentally good. It does not believe, as Plato does, that this reality is an illusion, that we are, and it does not believe, as Manichaeanism and various other beliefs of that time held, that this world, while real, is fundamentally debased and that it's our job to get past it. But nor does it believe that this world is all there is. And it is the marriage of these two, I think, that appeals to me about Christianity, intellectually. But I've already tried to say that there's a limit to how far you can go intellectually with thinking about these things. And so I have to say that Catholic Christianity appeals to me because of the lived reality of it. And that's a lived reality that I wouldn't have experience with if I had not been raised in the church. Perhaps I would have been introduced to it some other way. But it's certainly less likely. So when I came back to belief in God, and I was a skeptical believer of the Montaigne sort, I really did think that there were limits to what reason could tell you about God. I nonetheless wanted to orient myself and my life towards this truth. I wanted to get in a proper relationship with it. And I had the experience of Catholic religious practice already to hand. And so I gave it a try again. And in giving it a try, I found that it worked for me. I know that there are Catholics who will not think that that's a sufficient claim to make for a believing Catholic to make on behalf of the church, that it happened to work for me. I can't say that under different circumstances, a different system would not have worked equally well. But when you find a system that works for you, there is no particular need to go looking for another. As a skeptical believer, I don't particularly think it my job to convince other people of the universal truth of Catholicism, to talk them out of the beliefs that they hold, and to make a defense of my own as not just true for me, but universally true. But I can say that it's true for me. And not just, I don't mean simply to say in a vague way that this tradition matters to me, and that I had a kind of vague sense of there being something out there that could have as easily been expressed through some New Ageism or other forms of spirituality, and I decided to put it into Catholicism. I hold the claims of Catholicism for true. And I find that working as hard as I can to orient my life in the direction of those truths is the best way that I know how to feel that what I take to be the fundamental mystery and goodness of the world is being reflected in my own life.
Sorry if you already answered this, because I came a little bit late.
That's okay.
But you, at the very end, mentioned that the philosopher was discussing the picture model and how you can't know something from within, but you must learn it externally. And I was wondering, from a Christian perspective, how you would justify the idea that Christ became man, because it inherently requires you to believe that there is some information coming internally. And even if you justify that by saying it's a divine origin that became internal. How do you respond to that argument?
So so Wittgenstein was Jewish, and he was raised in a secular Jewish family, and he became very attracted to the Christian faith. And at some points in his life, I think what you would call a believer in the Christian faith, as the what I said at the end suggests. And here's how he related his theory to all of this. Right, his argument was that the truth cannot be stated; it can only be shown. And so you guys are all familiar with the Jefferson Bible, right? What Jefferson tried to do was turn Jesus into an ethical teacher. And what he said was, if you cut out all of the supernatural claims and essentially all the story of Jesus from the Gospels, you're left with things like the Sermon on the Mount, right? You're left with a bunch of ethical teachings. And that you can then live your life according to those ethical teachings. You can be an ethical Christian in a way that's entirely congruent with reason. And that's what he aspired to be. Wittgenstein did almost the opposite. The book he carried around in the war was A Life of Jesus, actually written by Tolstoy. It wasn't the Gospels, but it was like a biography of Jesus that told Jesus' life. And he thought that the ethical life could be shown, which is to say you could watch someone else living it, but it could not be explained or told, which is to say you could not be given a set of rules, right? Think about a game. Games were fascinating to Wittgenstein, as some of you may know, right? And think about whether you learn a game by being told all of the rules in advance, or by getting in there and playing it, right? Think about someone who is exceptionally good at a game or a sport, but actually can't tell you how they do it. Think about someone who is exceptionally good at a sport and actually doesn't even know what the rules are. It sometimes happens, right, when you're watching a football game or a basketball game, that you discover that one of the players on the court, there's some fine point of the rules that they didn't even know, right? But what they have is they have the excellence of practice. So the only way that they could tell you what it is to play the game in an excellent way is by showing you, by doing it. So Wittgenstein thought this is why Jesus came to earth. The Jewish faith gave you a set of laws and told you to follow them. The Christian faith showed you an ethical life and said, do this, be like this person. And he thought that also related to the fact that that Jesus had whittled all of the laws down to two, but really to one, right? Love. Love God as one, love your neighbor as the other, but when it comes down to it, the law is love. And then you ask, Kierkegaard among many brought this up, well, what if we don't know what it means to love? Tell me what rules I need to follow, and if I follow all of those rules, then I will have behaved in a loving way. But the answer is that if you follow all the rules, but you don't do it out of love, you haven't been good, right? Because the commandment is not to follow the rules; the commandment is to love. So that's where Wittgenstein's theories come into it. He said that the faithful life is something that can be shown but not stated.
Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Yeah,
and just was opening this book and reading the first few pages, and it's quite wild. The angel Gabriel comes to Mary and says, "Hail, full of grace," and the angel comes to you and pins you down and says, "You better believe." It's quite a difference. One question I have is maybe I need to continue reading, but is this a good angel who's trying to warn you of the things to come and being like, hey, you're going to have to hold on to your faith? Or is it perhaps a not so good angel, a fallen angel that's trying to drive a wedge between you and God through fear?
Well, for everyone else in the room, I'll just say he's referring to the opening pages of the book in which I describe an angelic visitation that I had when I was a teenager. if you do read on, you'll find that I later discovered that I suffered from something called sleep paralysis, which is a physiological phenomenon where you remain in REM sleep after you've come awake and you're paralyzed, and that it often is accompanied by a sense of dread or fear, and also very often by a sense that there's a presence in the room, and that people believe that many reports of alien abduction are cases of sleep paralysis. Medieval stories of incubi and succubi coming in the night also come from that. Something like half of people have at least one of these bouts in their life, but there's a much smaller percentage who get them with regularity, and I'm one of those people. So what happened was I had these consistent experiences throughout this earlier portion of my life, and then I came to have an objective scientific explanation for these subjective experiences. And then part of the story, and having that, those experiences were one of the things that made me hold on to my faith when I was otherwise losing it. So then when I had this explanation for it, that was one of the things that finally severed that faith. So the story of the book is the story of, on one hand, the objective scientific worldview, also the worldview down on the ground, and on the other hand, the subjective experiential worldview, but also the mountaintop worldview I've been talking about, and the ways that those things come together. So how they come together in this particular case, I will leave it to people to read the book to find out. It's also, I'll just say, it's 6 o'clock. If anyone needs to get up and leave, you're not offending me. I appreciate you having been here for this long.
Over here.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if I need to get handed a microphone to ask you a question. But so my question is a little bit of a personal one. So you spoke of people saying that they, once they left their undergraduate years, they weren't really asking themselves these questions. The undergraduates who are here may not feel like they have a lot of free time, but by the time they're 45, they may realize that they'll long for that time to think about things. As you encourage us to balance out our everyday obligations with time on the mountaintop, how do you personally make time for that, both in retreat or prayer, or also appreciation of the liberal arts, fitting it into the material concerns of life?
So let me say the first part about the undergraduate experience piece. So I'm not just suggesting that, when you're college students, you have more free time and you can spend it on leisure, right? I'm suggesting that the time in the classroom is leisure time, right? Because that's what leisure is. And that doesn't just mean, strictly speaking, the humanities, right? The natural sciences, when they are directed towards the end that I was talking about, which is knowing the world as a good in itself, right? They also qualify as leisure. Obviously, Aristotle was very concerned with the natural sciences, and natural philosophy, study of the natural world, was a subsection of philosophy until really the 18th century. So anytime you are in a class and you're trying to learn things for the sake of learning that thing in order to better understand the world and the reality around you, rather than thinking in the terms of, what is this going to get me later? What is this for? How is this going to help me on the job market? How is this going to help me get into the graduate school I want to go to, etc.? You're engaging in leisure. Anytime you're doing anything as an end in itself, you're engaging in leisure. The religious practice is a form of leisure in this sense, right? So we've come in the post-Baconian world to think of calling something leisure as treating it as basically slightly trivial, and so to say that your faith is a matter of leisure seems a little heretical, right? But quite the opposite. What the Greeks thought of the being at work as being unleisured. You didn't do your leisure in order to get back to productive, quote unquote, productive work. You did your productive work so you had food and a roof over your head so you could do the thing that mattered, which was engaging in leisure, which was doing things as an end in themselves. They were the things that made, to go back to Wittgenstein's question, life worth living. All the other stuff was the stuff you needed to do in order to have a life. And then this thing was the life, So I encourage you all, maybe I'm preaching to the choir when I'm talking with students who, again, are coming on an evening post class during exam week to come to a talk like this. But it's not just that I encourage you to be doing stuff like this, but I encourage you to be thinking about the classroom time as leisure, and the time on the playing fields as leisure, and the things you are doing here as ends in themselves and about life here. The older you get, the more you're going to have things that you are doing for some other reason, and particular things you are doing to make money in order to have the rest of your life. Unfortunately, we are now in a world where you're always at work because your phone, or because of the work from home, the lines have been pulled down. And in addition, the kinds of things that used to be leisure activities have been subsumed into this kingdom of means. So sports is like that, so we can't watch a game without gambling on it, and our hobbies are now side hustles, that we go take the thing onto Etsy to sell it because somehow we aren't allowed to take it seriously if we're not making money out of it, and then even our true leisure, our vacations or whatever, are posted on social media so that they have some effect on our standing in some hierarchy of status, So for adults, what I try to do is I do the work I have to do to support my family, and then I try to draw the lines when that is done, and when I'm not in it, I try to make as much of what I am doing about that thing I'm doing, and not treating that thing as a means towards some end. And that's also, even no matter what one's metaphysical commitments are, having a religious practice, going to mass in this case, it means that, obviously we don't want our whole faith life to just be about Sunday morning, and we don't live it out throughout the rest of the life. However, if you only just have an hour on Sunday mornings when you are not on your phone and you are thinking about what matters in this world and how to be a good person, then frankly you are ahead of most people walking around the world these days.
Oh, wonderful. Could you help pass it along to the fellow with glasses there? Yeah.
So following your argument about Wittgenstein, there was a new ideas of theology developed on his ideas of language, and basically there was this kind of new theology called post-liberal theology that basically states every religion is a set of communities that use their particular language to describe a set of doctrines. And they have every religion has their own community, own scriptures, own doctrines, and own theologies, and that will lead to a bad conclusion that there's nothing we can claim about other religions. In Catholicism, it's called pluralism or indifferentialism. What is your argument against this kind of post-liberal theology that basically ground every religion into a community language game?
I don't know that I have an argument against it. So what you're talking about is later Wittgenstein. I will spoil things a little by saying that he didn't stay at the monastery, and in fact he eventually went back to Cambridge, and he had a whole second half of his career, and it was in that half that he starts talking about language games and about language as not corresponding to the world in a straightforward way, but language as a game that is played within communities with a set of rules. And he started to take on a lot of beliefs that I think we would call sort of postmodern relativistic beliefs. And I don't share those beliefs. But if you're asking me from how can I find the proper standpoint from which I can point to other religious traditions and tell them that they're wrong, and I have privileged access to the truth, I would say that that's just fundamentally not part of my project. I feel like like I said, I'm here to love, and this tradition, I feel like helps me to do it. And again, I don't subscribe to it in a relativistic, it's just a community practice way. But you know, the word creed, in its Indo-European origins, is related to the word heart, right? Credo and cor, to believe something is to take it to heart. To have faith in something, right, is to live faithfully with it in the way that you're faithful to a spouse. And I take my Catholic faith very seriously, but I take faith in that sense. I attempt to be faithful to the Catholic Church, and I take the creed very seriously in that sense that I take it to heart and I try to live it as much as I can. And I simply do not think it is my job. Now, I'm not a theologian. I'm not actually a Christian apologist, notwithstanding the fact that I spent the last 5 years writing this book. I don't think it's my job to tell other people that their faith is wrong.
Well, on the note of believing with the whole heart, please join me in thanking this evening's speaker.
Yeah.